changed and exhumed the tar pits, so the dinosaurs come to the front of the room now. Again, let me thank those who preceded for their excellent synopses. It's indeed very difficult to capture the achievements of what is indeed a very distinguished group of individuals in such a short time period. And equally difficult, I think, will be the charge for this group to point to the things that they think we will need to confront, the challenges facing forensics in the future, to keep our activity viable and educational, and to keep doing what they have struggled to do throughout their careers to get it right. Turning them to them, reminding them that they do need to save some videotape for the next person, all but George. We'll go in alphabetical order, and that means Mike Barton will lead off.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to Greg for a gracious and kind introduction. But I feel compelled in the immortal words of Admiral Stockdale to suggest, who am I and why am I here? To be honest, hearing the introductions of my very distinguished colleagues, I find myself in a little bit of a loss because I still think of myself as a midlife professional. I still have lots of years to torture debaters and naïves. In fact, next year, for the first time in many years, now that my children have got to an appropriate age, I'm jumping back into the debate van, which I know is creating shudders all through the great Northwest. But then I sort of thought about it, and thought about the 30 or so years that I've been a participant or a coach in forensics, and thought about the people who were active when I started, and they aren't there anymore, with the exception of people like these up here. And I began to wonder about that and think about why that is the case. And I suspect it has to do with the fact that being a debate coach ought to be measured in dog years. And that is, every year you're a forensic coach is really 7 years off your life. Which also explains the kind of comments I still get on if I stand too close to the postings and they talk about being judged by an old SOB. Any event, as I thought about this, I felt like I ought to start with a little bit of looking back, and so I will do that. For those of you who are flowing, you need to take out a separate sheet and label this Mike's off-case anecdote. Label Mike learns about debate. I remember it as vividly as if it were yesterday. It was in November of 1966. I was a sophomore in high school, and I know you'll find this very hard to believe, but as a sophomore in high school, I was all of 4'10", maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. I went to a small high school in eastern Washington where the classes were combined. We had elective classes with seniors through sophomores. And so at my mother's insistence, I was taking the speech class. And there were seniors in here, including a senior named Dave. Dave was a linebacker whose hobbies, when he wasn't trying to decapitate quarterbacks, was pulling the wings off flies and torturing small, vulnerable sophomores. So we sat in the speech class together for this entire semester, and he was constantly harassing me. Well, we get to November, and the teacher says, well, we're going to do this new unit. It's called Lincoln-Douglas debate. And of course, the blank expressions of everybody in this classroom, we thought he was speaking in tongues for all we knew about what he was talking about. He went through and explained the format of the Lincoln-Douglas debate. He said, I'm going to give you a topic, I'm going to assign who will be the affirmative and who will be the negative, and you'll get a week to prepare, and we'll do it in class. So he looks around, and first he announced the topic, resolved that the United States should extend diplomatic recognition to Cuba. And he looks around and says, oh, let me see, Mike, you'll be the affirmative. And I said, okay, no problem here. Looks around, and I don't know whether intentionally or unintentionally, looks at Dave, says, Dave, you're going to be the negative. And of course, you can imagine how I felt. It was like, it's bad enough this guy's been torturing me the entire semester. Now the teacher, the authority figure, has said it's okay. And so I was just paranoid. I petrified. What do I do? So I thought, well, I guess I'll follow the directions and go to the library and find information about why we should extend diplomatic recognition to Cuba and be as ready as I could. So, boy, I lived in that small high school library. I wrote all this stuff out. I kind of cut it out and put it on my little evidence card, my 4x6 cards, and my little recipe box, as we all did at that stage in life. Get to the day of the debate. I could barely sleep the night before. I was virtually sick about it. Stand up, shaking, give my first affirmative speech. And at that point, I had occasion to look over at Dave. like he'd been shot. Because not only did he think this was going to be just an open opportunity to torture the sophomore, but he had done no preparation whatsoever. And at that moment, I learned the essential truth that debate is an activity that builds courage, that is essential to the growth and development of society and people. And I think about that story as, like many of us have spent various times despairing about the future of forensics and wondering if it's all worth it. And remembering that we all have to keep in mind that what we do is awfully important, and it's valuable, and it's worthy, and the careers of these people up here, I think, are testimony to the value and importance of debate and speech training. In thinking back, what has happened in the past, at least from my perspective, it seems to me there have been three trends that I have noticed in the 20 years that I've been at PLU, and about 5 years before that as an active forensic coach, that I think, at least to me, talk about what we're going to face in the future. And the first is to note that debate in forensics is constantly changing. The activity is nothing like it was, when I started out. If for nothing else, Motel 6 back in 1974 actually cost $6 for a motel room, as opposed to what it is today. Individual events meant you did oral interpretation, which meant programmed readings, or impromptu, or extemp, oratory, or informative. Debate didn't have cross-examination in it when I started out in college. Lincoln-Douglas debate wasn't a high school event, at least in Washington State, until relatively recently, let alone such things as CETA, NETA, NPDA, etc., the whole panoply of new activities. So there's just been this constant sense of change that I think is really important, or helps characterize forensics. Secondly, with respect or apologies to Shakespeare, the center does not hold. Most of the change that I have noticed, particularly in the past 20 years, which I think has been a time of tremendous change, particularly in debate, has been the result of reaction. Reaction to things that people did not like about what was happening in the activity. The reaction that came when CETA was formed as an organization never envisioned by Jack Rhodes and Jack Howell and people who began this, I believe, as going to become the big monolithic national organization it became. Instead, it was envisioned as an alternative, just something for people to do who did not have the time or energy to participate in debate. I think that's clearly the impetus for the NPDA, which is by far the fastest growing trend in forensics. The fact that it's just exploded, particularly in the West. It's by far, we're having tournaments with 80, 100, 120 NPDA teams, which is an amazing, I think, trend. And it's a reaction to what people perceive to be some of the excesses or things they don't like about the current form of policy debate. And so I think this constant sense of evolution or change or reaction to what the status quo is characterized the activities. But along with that, and here I'm focusing a little bit on debate as opposed to individual events, so maybe there's a comparison here. The third point I would make about the past, it seems to me, at least in my career, it's getting harder and harder to do well in individual events, while it's getting easier and easier to be successful in debate. Okay, and I say that advisedly. I think that certainly to be successful in the national level debate is still a tremendously difficult and time-consuming activity. But on the other hand, you notice to me that the big change to the NPDA, for example, in the West is becoming by far the dominant form is it does not take nearly the amount of preparation or research time or commitment that is taken for other forms of debate. And that isn't because our students are dumber or less capable of doing debate. It's because the pressures on students have changed. The idea that when I started, all I did was debate. That was my activity. I didn't have to worry about having a work-study job because tuition was so cheap at the state university I went to. And that's not the case for students now. They have to have part-time jobs. They have to have internships. They have to study abroad, hopefully, and do all the broadening life experiences that we expect of them. And to that extent, they don't, maybe, as many students don't have the time to commit to the amount of time and energy it takes to do debate. And so in that sense, while debate has evolved, particularly becoming, in a sense, many ways less time-consuming. I'm not sure what to make of that trend, whether that's, while in my heart of hearts I wish it wasn't the case, I suspect there's no turning back the clock. I would note 3 or 4 trends that I would see for the future in terms of where we're going. I think the first and foremost problem is recruiting and retaining forensics educators. Noting that, if we're measuring debate coach and IE coaches' lives in dog years, we've got to find special people who will commit a career to the activity. Depending on people to be in for 2 or 3 years and then moving on to something else, while that group of people is awfully important, we need people who are in it for the long term, who can think globally, who can make decisions in the activity that don't, maybe are in the short term, are negative for their own debate program, but are important for the good of the order. So I hope we find ways to make debate be perceived in the speech communication community as being a valuable use of people's times. Secondly, I wish we could find a better balance between the rhetorical elements represented in forensics, the kinds of invention and research connected with policy debate, the kinds of delivery skills that can be learned only through individual events, and the kinds of stylistic benefits that NPA parliamentary debate provides. I wish we could find a balance there. I have no formula for that, and I know I'm spitting into the wind, as it were, that we're simply not ever going to find anything that's perfect. But I hope we would keep moving in that direction. Third, I think we need to shorten the debate season. I've thought that for a number of years. I wish that forensics took less time. I think if we're expecting people to become tenured, if we're expecting people to have a real life, we've got to give them time to do that. Fourth, we need to strengthen how we assess forensics. Assessment is, of course, the great kind of bull in the china shop. All of us have traditionally used anecdotes saying, well, I've had great students. I personally benefited from forensics. And that's not good enough anymore for administrators. They want to know how and why what we do is good. And forensics, I think, has been slow to come to that discussion about how we assess and justify what we do. And 5, of course, I think we need to improve our service to non-traditional populations. Students are different than when I started out. The 18 to 21-year-old is rapidly becoming the minority of students on a college campus. We get non-traditional students, we get persons of color, and women, and underserved populations. We need to do a better job of serving them. So I get back in the debate band this fall with a sense of newness and refreshingness and feeling that the debate is an important and worthy activity. And the kinds of comments I've heard of this panel today reinforce that belief. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. Thanks, Scott and colleagues. I really appreciated the presentations. I remember them for a long, long time. It's been a long month with a little bit of treasure past from people like DJ Neighbors and Ralph Eubanks. I remember taking a group of students to that first tournament that Georgia Bowman hosted several years ago in the early 60s. And the notion was that the whole tournament would be conducted in one day. Yes, you can bring your students up, you can have one day of competition, and I think the fee total was less than $20 for the whole tournament. But if you chose to spend the night, you could spend the night in a Liberty, Missouri hotel for $6 a night, and the great fire escape was a rope in every room to let yourself down, or to use for some other purpose if you didn't do well in the tournament. So with that kind of beginning and the great frozen towels of Northwest Missouri State, my career began in forensics. It's been a long, long way since we seem to always pack the sack lunches, put them in a car, as my colleagues can remember, and the last student had to hold the sack of sack lunches, and you crammed as many kids in a family car. That meant your wife didn't have a car for the weekend. Some of you can identify with that, or your spouse. And off you went to some tournament hosted by Ada Mae Howery or someone else. My friend Gary Horn, for many years, as a part of his invitation to us from Southwestern College, friend Tracy, would say to us, yes, come, Bob, and we'll try to find you housing. He somehow knew that my budget wouldn't allow us to spend the night, and so he would knock on doors of faculty members to see who would let some kids sleep on the floors of their homes. There's so many challenges that emerge. I like what Dr. Mike has said about how this whole thing continues to move. I often use the phrase, and I don't think it's original, that debate forensics continue in a liquid state. And now and then we think the little moles occur, and when we do, we take a picture of them and think, wow, this is it. This is where we are. This is where we've been trying to go. And then all of it turns liquid again, and it's running into new little molds, and we're going to see where it flows and what's going to come. As I understood, my brief challenge for a couple of minutes is to mention some things that challenge me. If I were getting to do my last speech, and I hope this is not, I would mention 2 or 3 things that continue to challenge me as someone who loves forensics. And my list, I'm sure, shadows over in some comments that my colleagues have made or will make, so that will be okay too, because duplication signals something. I would list number 1 as charting a program that's educational and student-oriented. Over and over again, we have to ask, what is the purpose of this activity, and why are we doing all of these things anyway? And quickly, we have to determine a philosophy. Why do we engage in the activity? What makes us motivated? Why do we do the things that we do? And we have to be much more efficient in integrating our programs with the total university curriculum. We conduct this activity on these weekends when other people leave the halls, and we spend hours with it, but who knows when we get to the mailbox on Monday morning or to the photocopier. Oh, you've been out on a trip, have you? What did you do? Did you go on a pleasure trip? Sure, 16, 18 hours a day for pleasure. We have to determine facets of the program that we think justify our time and involvement and dollars. And speaking of dollars, as we continue to spend more and more, it's been a long way since those few entry fees that were so tiny. Now when we write checks that are almost mega checks to those of us who are educators for a tournament, we can hardly believe our eyes. Certainly the challenge of the long forensic season that just continues and the long forensic tournaments continue, that kind of problem continues to challenge me. I jokingly tell some of my colleagues teaching at a religious institution, I often say, that tournament is running longer than a Baptist gathering. It just goes on and on and on. And somewhere, someone has to stop. I try to tell them, I even walk out of church when it gets too long. So the longer terms and then the ever-shifting ground for the director, being a strong contender that forensics positions, above all, need to be tenure track forever. And those recognitions must be given for those hours of involvement. The insecurity that young educators sometimes feel when they tackle this program and say, what's this going to do for me career-wise in the days ahead? And of course, ethical dimensions are forever a problem and a concern for all of us. Now, 2 or 3 implications. I think, again, from my point of view, we need to respect diversity with so much intensity that we see the values in so many different kinds of programs, that we need to have the courage to scrutinize what we're doing educationally, organizationally, and individually. And we certainly have to decide how the public fits into all of this. The public must be involved. And I'd like to see the day again when forensics programs get just as excited about the reading hour that the public comes to, or the public debate, as we do the tournament debate. All of these dimensions are critical to our lives, and those are only a few of the challenges that I see. Thanks for the chance to share. Appreciate
it. In answer to the question, what do you do with old buffaloes? This is certainly an interesting format for displaying them. About 3 or 4 years ago, we tried another format at Central States, I think it was in Minneapolis at that time, which was the trial. We accused George Ziegenmiller of impiety, and so there was a trial, there was a defense, and a number of his students then had to decide. He was incidentally found guilty. And so My first observation, I guess, would be we might think of a different way of going at this other than the encomiums, which is the trial, where you really are put on, have to defend those positions that you made. Second observation, I guess I would make, which I'm sure is clear to people who have seen the 70s program, and that is polyester is coming back. I know we all feel good about it. And the third is a kind of an interesting comment about a preoccupation with chronology, which we're going through. 3 years ago, the NDT had its 50th anniversary. This year, the AFA is going to have its anniversary. If we can get to January 1st, 2001, we'll turn a whole century, etc. From my standpoint, it's a little bit like re-paraphrasing Nietzsche's comment, what is this nonsense about counting heads, to what is this nonsense about counting years? But it seems to me that the Greeks had an interesting idea when they argued, at least in part, that with age comes wisdom. Somehow built into the notion of doing this for many years came certain kinds of wisdom. Aristotle argues this, especially in the politics, although when he gets to the rhetoric, he says, yeah, but when you get old, you get cranky, you get conservative, you get bald, you get just a whole variety of things which make you less than an ideal citizen. So I'm not exactly sure where Aristotle winds up on this. But it seems to me that the Greek notion that with age came wisdom is a little better than our notion of with age comes problems, and hopefully you have health insurance to cover them, which is kind of an American attitude to this whole aging process, and wisdom seems to be left out. There's a tendency, I think, to look back with great nostalgia about the great old days when giants walked the earth. Well, I was there. Giants didn't walk the earth, and they weren't great old days. So it seems to me we can dispose a lot of those things as preparatory to what's going to come up. So, for example, rather than complain about what is happening now and praising what would happen, I could probably reverse the thing. I was at Kansas for a lot of years. I can't even count them. How many?
Quarter century as a coach.
A quarter century. It is good to have these details there. Although I guess I should say to Jeff that as a youngster, I was a Cubs fan. And I was a Cubs fan because that was the only one with broadcast where I lived. And they were consistently in 8th place. They were always at the very bottom. You're going to go see them, right?
Scottish.
Oh, Scottish.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I shifted to the Royals, and they stayed in 8th place, so you can keep that and just interchange teams. Frankly, I guess I'm fairly happy about things. I thought after I retired for a while that having my weekends would be wonderful, and they are. They truly are. In fact, for a short period of time, I totally resented all the ones I didn't have before when my kids were growing up, and I forgot their names and things like that. But as I've argued to debaters, I think to a certain extent, debate is a disease of the blood. And I think that's true of individual events too. That is, there is something that gets into you that wants to express part of your being in that kind of activity. I think it changes your thinking, it changes the whole, your personality, not always positively. But you are different because you engage in the activity. And it's not just like a quick blood transfusion takes it away from you. It's there. I thought about that because about 3 or 4 years later, they asked if I would have any interest in directing the national debate tournament. My first reaction was, well, no, that's on the weekend. And then I got to thinking about it, and I think to a certain extent, when you spend your whole life doing this, you feel you have an obligation to the activity. And even in retirement, you come out, and I noticed there were some other ones here, to do certain things for the activity, because the activity has been part of you, and you become part of it. So for the last 7 years, I have directed the national debate tournament. Actually, what I've done is I've watched them turn on the computer, which directs the national debate tournament, and pretended that I was in charge of the computer. So that's another story. As several have already indicated, I just have a couple of observations. Many of the recent changes, it seems to me, have improved the state of the activity. The recent changes were very often criticisms of what was happening before. And sometimes that criticism was, we're going to form a different organization, and we'll form an organization of organizations. And we'll begin to split that out as a way of saying, we weren't comfortable with the way we were participating earlier. I think this was very healthy. I think it was healthy that there was a split between NDT and CETA, although I argued about 6 or 7 years ago it would be healthier for some educational programs if they got combined in a sense so that you had greater opportunities for students, and that looks like the direction it's going. For example, this year, the CETA tournament was in Illinois, and the NDT was at Wayne State University, brilliantly hosted, I might add, by Dr. Ziegler. And some coaches thought that Illinois and Michigan were very close together, so they combined these. And the debaters were lying on the floor mostly, I guess. Next year, the CETA tournament is going to be in one part of Kansas City, and the NDT tournament in another part of Kansas City, so one could even combine both of those activities. So I think there's some thinking about how can we get the maximum benefit out of the kinds of activities we have. But such things that has been mentioned as the NPDA, and a number of changes, it seems to me, have indicated that the activity is very healthy. We've often said our activity is not healthy, and then we've defined it by a subset of activities and not looked overall at the activity. It seems to me that if we look overall, it is indeed very healthy. Secondly, I think it is not totally a white male activity. My visual aids to the contrary. And I think we've gone, I watched, I just tried to get a picture of people who introduced us. And then I thought, well, we ought to have this again in 2029. We ought to do this every 30 years, whether we need to or not, and see who will be up here. And my guess is that there will be far more of what we saw here from the people who we introduced than people who we honor. So I think there are some changes coming. I do not think we have done very well with color. I really don't. And one of the activities that excites me most is the activity that's going on. George has done some of this, and Melissa Wade at Emory, excuse me, of bringing the debate activity to high schools where there is none, where they're largely minority schools, where they don't know what the debate process can do. And it seems to me that may be the way to build into it, because frankly, most debaters that did not have any experience in high school are reluctant to start it in college. And so as we can cut into this in high school, it seems to me we're going to have a much broader base of participation. The last thing I think I would simply say in my optimism is that I think what debate does in part is honors an oral tradition, if we can kind of go back to the Greeks. And I worry about the oral tradition. I worry about people that say, I'm going to go have a conversation in the chat room. I think when we begin to think about that, we are using technology as ways of excluding and not including the oral tradition. And I think that we need to resist things that says, well, let's have our tournaments at home and simply press some buttons, which I think in 20 years we're going to do. And those materials will flow out, etc. It seems to me the oral tradition is an exchange of ideas, and that exchange of ideas is a person. As long as we stay clear with that, it seems to me we're not going to be victims of technology, but able to use that technology. Thank you.
Certainly, I appreciate Linda Treadaway and the way that she introduced me, and also I appreciate Robert for having such a panel together. This is really important because I think these ideas that we're going to talk about today are really important. I know some that I want to share with you I think are important as well. I guess I come from the old school of interpretation, and so not like all the rest of the guys who speak impromptu, I did prepare a few notes, and I hope that's okay. I'll refer to them periodically. I do want you to know that, at least by Michael Bartman's standards, in dog years, I guess I'm about 245 years old at this particular point in my forensic activity, so maybe that's why I've lost my hair. I mean, I can't expect us to have everything. But anyway, today I want to tell you a little bit about my program because it's interesting in that we see it as really a full-service program. I always thought debate was extremely important, but I also thought IEs were as important as debate was. And so I wanted my students to really experience the totality of the communication experience, and that's really what I've striven to do. I guess one of the things that was really important to me is working with students at all levels. I go back to thinking about that, the young lady who walked in my office with an ACT of 8 and said, gee, I heard about this, I'd really like to give it a shot. And I said, you're more than welcome, let's do it. And then also the students who come to me with ACTs of 32. And so to me, that's one of the real joys and real blessings, I guess, in my life, is to work with students at every particular level. I'm going to center mostly on, I think, debate in my talk today, though, because I think that's important. And as I began to think about this, I thought, by 1999, I guess we would have assumed that debate would have found its place, settled on a schema or methodology that all would agree upon and would be able to present itself to administrators and educators on the united front. And I think that's far from the truth. But I ask the question, is that all bad? And I, kind of like Don, I simply say, no, that's not all bad. Not all bad at all. For debate, like all society, finds constantly that we are in the throes of change. Hopefully, always for the better, though. And so, do we find ourselves resistant to change? In fact, I think Glenda, when she introduced me, she said simply, he likes to change. I used to think that I was really resistant to that, but I really find that I think as the older I get, I like change a lot. And the reason being, I started off like some of these guys, and I'll give a story in just a minute about MDT, where I was in the 60s. That sort of thing, and I thought, wow, this is it, this is where it will always be, and that sort of thing. And gee, when I started my program in 1970 at UAM, I thought, this is where I will always be. And today I have students competing in the IPDA Nationals in Louisiana. Who in the world would have ever thought I would have ever done that? But that's where I am. And so I think that's interesting. So we find ourselves in the middle of change. But some people have not. Some, I think, will have to in the future. Having now, I think, spanned more than 3 decades in this particular activity of participation, the big picture, I think, maybe is a little more clear to than it was in 1964 when I actually began this. And that was interesting in 1964, and I want to give you an example of really what happened there. In one particular tournament that I participated, someone had the audacity to present and these guys will all know about that, a comparative advantage case. Is there a way to treat the analysis of the affirmative resolution? Now granted, this was in the South, and things were, and maybe are a little slow to change, but what a novel idea of affirmative analysis. I thought it was interesting. Okay, so the need is understood for a personal mode of vehicular transportation. But to drop the need analysis and go to directly arguing which was better, the Ford or the Chevrolet, that was an unheard of approach at that particular time. And that's exactly what the judge said in rendering the decision. The judge simply said, wow, the need was dropped, and therefore the decision goes negative. Now the rest of the story, we all know what happened to affirmative comparative advantage cases. Kind of became the standard. There was all sorts of spin-offs from that, and there we went. And so it's really kind of interesting, but it changed. Things changed. But we were kind of resistant to it. And so support for the idea that change is inevitable is really seen in a lot of different things, especially the diversity of organizations that support a particular type or style of debate. Now let me count all the different ways. No, I don't want to do that. We don't have enough time. But just think about what some of these different groups are, the flavor, the variety of them. NDT, CETA, NPDA, NFA, NEDA, NPDA, APDA, ADA, IPDA, and we could just go on and on and on and on with all these. And then, of course, the honoraries. They support one or more different types of styles. They're advocated by all these different organizations that a lot of us support. And so the choices, I think, are numerous for involvement in debate and forensics participation in a particular organization. But now, is this bad? We ask ourselves that question. Well, no, I think there's benefit in diversity. I might even contend that due to this diversity, more institutions, more programs are actually involved in debate forensics than ever before. Why? Not any one type or style may fit that institution, that coach, that student, etc. I'm not sure I would have argued that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago. But hopefully, in some measure, of developing more effective communicators, because I think that's really what our goal is, or it should be. And oh yes, that goal. At least that's what I tell parents, administrators, benefactors. Now, within the debate and forensics community, new ideas on how the activity should be done to achieve the sought positive result have resurfaced and have come to fruition and gone full circle. And we all know those stories. For example, some that broke away 15 years ago and now we're here to the fold. They are just like them and that sort of thing. And so I think we even have to consider that. Things change, things go back to the way they were. Somebody already mentioned polyester's back. Yeah, you know how I am. I just got rid of them last year. Now they tell me they're back. But that's the way we are. You know? And a lot of times we've even heard the phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. You heard that? Sure we have. Well, nothing new under the sun. But I think there is something new under the sun, and I think modern technology is that. And where it has taken us in debate is coming awfully close to refuting that age-old adage, nothing new under the sun. I want to give you a couple of examples. The International Parliamentary Debate Association has just concluded the first international debate via the computer internet. I don't know how many of you know about that, but it's kind of an interesting situation. Not only were the debaters from all over the world, but the judges were as well. From Singapore, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from England, from Israel, from the United States, from Canada. Rather interesting assemblage. Not only were the debaters from all over the world, but those judges were all over the world as well. And meeting in the finals, the results will be announced in Louisiana tonight. A debater from the United States and a debater from the Israeli Debating Society in the finals of that particular event. In that same room and face-to-face, as the tradition of one-on-one or Lincoln Douglas debate would have it? Absolutely not. These finalists are thousands of miles apart, streaming words back and forth over the privacy of their keyboards as arguments flow and wane before the monitored eyes of judges too, thousands of miles apart. So that's a lot of change. And technology continues, I think, as well to amaze us. This past month, in two far-reaching communities in a somewhat rural state, not known for its far-reaching proclivity to being the first, they have achieved the first in debate. Two colleges, one affectionately known as the Piney Bio campus, participated in a compressed interactive video debate in real time, yet hundreds of miles apart. Student debaters, coaches, audience participants, and a minimal number of technicians, two. One at each site simply walked into a room on their individual campuses, and the switch was flicked, the topic announced, and debate was on live, interactive. Now this is a far cry from the seemingly endless train rides that brought two colleges together at the beginning of the 20th century that Tracy knows about from Southwestern College. And this new technology can now bring the world together to debate in real time before audiences of hundreds, maybe even millions, and simply provide a round of practice debate at a reasonable cost in money and certainly time. And so tournaments may change, as we know. For example, not even having to leave campus to participate. Yeah, I think there's something nostalgic that we're going to miss in this whole thing. You know, those rides in the van. When I started off, the van had no radio, no air conditioning, and periodically they were so old and untried that the doors fell off when we parked on an incline. Those sorts of things we'll miss. The blistering desert, the blizzard plains, and the darkened nights on roads that we think that we're the only people left on the universe, and that sort of thing. Well, possibly we'll come to a time in intercollegiate debate when those memories will no longer be made, but only read about in the annals of time in the archives of forensic associations. Now, my wife was telling me about this because she looked at my remarks on the plane. And she said, you know, but the great thing that we're going to lose if we're really not careful about that, especially in our program where we are, is the socialization that's occurred because of what you have done. Because you have given students in a rural experience something that they would never have had otherwise. For example, I'm only 40 miles from the Mississippi River. A number of students, until they got in my program, had never seen the Mississippi River. First time to ever see it, like crossing it on the van on the way to the picture. Kind of interesting. And so there's some things we lose. And thus change is all around us, continue to be. It's inevitable. As debaters, we are, in a sense, agents of change, and we always have been arguing what is best for mankind and even how to achieve it. What a marvelous activity to be associated with. What adventure. And Indiana Jones thought he had a corner on the market. Not so. I really think we did. Adventure it has been. And I'm really not too sure why anyone would think that I would be able to tell or even predict about the future. Because that's what Linda brought up about my cartwheels. Jim Norway was sitting with some of my students on a curb one day, and my students asked me, Mr. Ray, is there anything in the world that you would do for us if we could win a first place sweepstake award? And I said, well, gee, I don't know. I really don't know. And Jim Norway said, well, this man used to be a gymnast. You ought to have him do a cartwheel for you if you'd win a first place sweepstakes. And they said, oh, would you, sir? And I said, oh, no, I could never do that. And Jim just kept egging them on. So finally, as I tallied the scores in my mind, I thought, no way possible. Couldn't possibly win a sweepstakes. Well, that afternoon I did 3. And I went on to do 12 more that semester. So I'm not sure how good I am at predicting the future. So what we all have to think about as we really face the future as debate and forensic professionals is a modicum, I think, of toleration for the new kid on the block. Well, that new kid can mean a difference in style, topic analysis, procedure, methodology, ad infinitum. And so remember, this is what I want to leave you with, that debate is better than no debate at all. And that's what we have to keep alive at all costs for all peoples. And yes, I still believe that debate is the best game in town, at least when Mark McGuire is not at bat. I had to say that since we're here in San Luis. And remember, there is no record that cannot be broken, for nothing stays the same.
I want to thank Tracy, of course, for that gracious introduction, and also thank Bob, as many have, for putting on this program. I was making a list on hotel stationery just this morning of some of the people who might have been included had this happen years ago, or maybe some of the other people that Bob might have invited. And this is not in any way a complete list. This is sort of random association of people who might have been. But as we stand on shoulders of giants, and I don't know how giants we are, I think it's useful to look back and remember names like Grace Walsh, Al Johnson, Harold Jordan, Don Olson, Scott Noble, Jerry Sanders, Annabelle Haygood, Martin Holcomb, Jim McMath, Bill DiMugio, Roy Murphy, Vernon McGuire, Bob Huber, Holt Spicer, Jack Howe, Lucy Keel, Mel Morehouse, Roger Nevergall, and of course, the great Glenn Capp. And I think there's so many people who could have been included that I'm humbled by being here. I think all of us are honored and humbled by being on this program. I haven't really been actively involved in debate and forensics since 1992 when I became chair of the Department of Communication at Miami University. However, I have continued that interest. I did coach debate there for some 6 years, Tracy, before becoming department chair, and during that time we hosted the National Debate Tournament twice. One time we even had the vegetarian plates. Okay? At any rate, with all of those memories in the background, I did want to say that there's a different perspective that you might get. It's a little hard to write about forensics when you're not right there because, as many people have said today, forensics changes very quickly. And so to write about tournament practices is not very easy because you're not au courant with what's happening in tournament practices. Sometimes we move glacially. And I attend some meetings at programs and conventions, and I think I'm hearing the same debate over practices that I participated in 30 years ago. And the NPDA, for example, the last meeting I attended was at the San Diego convention of the NCA, and at that time they were trying to get a lot of ground rules straight, just as NEDA and CEDA and NDT and all the other organizations and the honoraries for their conventions and conferences have done. So we move pretty fast. These days, articles I've been writing, as Ben I think knows, tend to be book reviews. The latest one was a book review of a book on the history of the city of Breckenridge, Texas. So I'm pretty far removed from day-to-day scholarship in forensics, and yet I have a lot of interest and a lot of hopes. What I'd like to do is focus on the hopes and just say for a moment that these will be 3 comments that I hope have changed since 1992, and I think there's some good indication today that maybe they have. My last real glimpse into day-to-day forensics was last year when we hosted the Delta Sigma Rho Tau Kappa Alpha National Conference on the Miami Hamilton campus. And I want to tell you one difference in perspective. I really appreciated the staff and the faculty of Miami Hamilton, their cooperation. We made that part of our 30th anniversary celebration. The reason I mention this is all that hosting of NDT and high school nationals, the things George went through this last year. I know to host the things Don and so many of you have done, hosting, all of you, hosting tournaments, and Tracy, all these years. I was so pleased to learn that when you are the CEO of the campus, there are some things that are a little bit easy. Call the registrar and say, well, I know it's over spring break, but I wouldn't want any competing events. And she calls back in an hour and says, I've cleared away all the competing events. We moved them some other place. And you call the legislative liaison at Miami University and say, we'd like to have the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He says, I think so. And a day later calls back and says, she'll be there. And the state senators and the mayor and so forth. This was very helpful. And Liz, you'll remember judging some of those rounds at the tournament. Appreciate that. We had a number of community people. But I just wanted to share that insight with you. I wish I could go back, wave some magic wands, recapture the vegetarian plates from 1989, and move forward in some other ways, because it made me realize how darn hard people work in tournaments, how really hard it is to host tournaments, and not always with cooperative administrations trying to get things done. Well, I hope that by now or in the near future, 3 things. Let's pretend we go back to 1992 and just look forward. I would hope that by now forensics would be more diversified, more multicultural. There have been references to this by all of the previous speakers. I would hope we would have more multicultural participants, more use of ideas and readings from multicultural authors, more courses perhaps in communication that dealt with cross-cultural or making progress there, and more debate issues related to global and multicultural affairs. Also non-traditional students, as at least one speaker has mentioned. And the one absence that we can see on the panel today particularly is the absence of somebody being honored specifically for work with community colleges. We had an introducer, but I think if we're here in 30 more years, Don, I think we would probably see more emphasis on the community college participation in forensics as well. Secondly, I would hope that since 1992, forensics has become more electronic. And certainly in tournament administration that has happened. I was really happy. You know, you go to conferences to learn new things, and David Ray told me something new. I did not know about the IPDA, and I did not know about this use of that kind of actual time. I think that's great. I knew about some examples at Miami, of course, because Ben keeps me updated. Electronic extemp. I knew there's some events like that. I know that we did do a Hamilton campus, Oxford campus audience debate, and people could participate in real time. I think that's wonderful. More and more of that, I hope. I also see at tournaments, if I drop in, I see all the laptops. And I think the NDT probably, George, I'm guessing, had to provide a tremendous number of outlets and resources for people to use. So some of that has probably happened. But I think even more should happen, especially in distance learning. I think that would enhance multiculturalism. I think it would produce larger audiences. It might even bring back some league competition that has sort of atrophied over the years because one more trophy, one more way to travel, one more time, end of the year, and some leagues couldn't compete with that, like the Missouri Valley. And finally, I would hope that forensics is more involved in research and particularly graduate education. I appreciated Tracy's remarks about my constant interest in writing about our responsibilities for the future in terms of research and scholarship and education. I gave a paper in New Orleans some years ago on a panel, I believe George chaired, about the importance of training graduate students in forensics. I agree with everything that's been said about tenure track and about their professional responsibilities, but I believe we have a responsibility, and in 1992 we were largely getting the nearby law student to coach debate, or we weren't really keeping the best and the brightest all the time in forensics. They were moving on to other fields for a variety of reasons. I hope we've been able to do better than that, and I hope we will continue to do that to keep our professionalism and our standards high. I hope these things have happened. I think many of them have, and to the extent that they haven't, it's on to the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, as you notice, one of the things that happens when you get to be an old dinosaur is you don't always have the control that you had when you were younger. 4 years ago, I lost my ability to walk. I could not have no movement from my waist down. And I thought that was the end of my forensics career. I thought that was the end of my teaching career. And luckily, the forces were with me, and I learned how to walk again through some operations, etc., and I was able to continue my forensics career, and I hope to continue it for decades to come. I thoroughly enjoy the activity. I thoroughly enjoy my relationship with people such as you in the audience, and I feel like I'm at the Oscars today, because to be included with a panel of this stature is indeed an honor, and I certainly do appreciate that. I look back to my forensics career, and I started in high school doing an event called memorized oratory, where you memorize the speech of somebody else and then you have to deliver it. And my first contest was in the American Legion Hall in Winnebago, Minnesota. And I got up and I got halfway through that speech and had a memory block. And I thought I stood there for 5 minutes. My coach told me it was really only about 30 seconds, but you know, it was eternity for me. And I thought that would be the last time I'd ever do such a thing. And obviously that has not held true. Like the other panelists have mentioned, forensics was different. It has changed a great deal. When you did oral interp, you had 1 round of poetry, you had 1 round of prose, maybe 1 round of drama, and then if you made it to the final round, you could use your choice. So that you had to do all 3, and that was it on that particular standpoint. My first extemp speech was on, does President Eisenhower spend too much time on the golf course? And I enjoyed that particular topic and had a good time with it. I think the growth in forensics in the 39 years that I have been involved has been tremendous. It's also been echoed by members on the panel. We have seen the growth of numerous activities. We have seen the growth of numerous organizations. And to pick up what Dr. Ray said, the standpoint of the debate is good, regardless of what format you file. If you do that, I think we have a number of honoraries that are good because they meet different needs. We certainly have different national individual events tournaments, and they meet different needs of different programs, and I think that's what we should remember. And at the same time, we're starting to see a unification. We do see these organizations working more closely together. We see many of these organizations now affiliating with the umbrella organization of AFA, so that there is some sense of unity where they can do some planning and they can do some talking together, and yet still keep their individual interests alive and serve their particular constituents in that respect. And I think that's all very, very good. There have been attempts to shorten the season. I can remember when the NFA was the last tournament, or Interstate Oratory really was the last tournament of the year, and it was always the first weekend in May. Well, now that has moved back, so it's at least up into April, and both AFA and NFA have moved their tournaments up so that they're much earlier than April than they have been in the past. And I think that move will probably continue to shorten the season. And I always like to go back to the word of choice. The season is only as long as you choose it to be. Because I think many directors of forensics forget that they are in control of their season. And they can choose when they go to that first tournament. It doesn't have to be the beginning of September. And they can choose how many tournaments they go throughout the year. And so it comes down to that philosophy statement that Bob Derryberry mentioned. What philosophy do you have for a program, and what do you need to meet that particular philosophy? And so we need to think of that along those particular lines. As I looked at the people that presented us today, I think the future is in very fine hands. I think we have some very strong, excellent people leading programs and that will provide leadership for the future. And I also echo that I think in 30 years there will be a lot more women on this particular panel. And I hope that there will be individuals from various ethnic backgrounds on the panel as well. As the tournament director of the NIET this past year, I did notice a large increase in the number of minority and various other cultural aspects among the students participating in the tournament. And I felt that was good because it did have that diversity there that we hope to achieve. But like the rest of the panels, I think there are some things that we do need to think about for the future. I think there are some concerns. One of the concerns I have is the amount of attention that might be given to various national tournaments. That some people tend to forget that there are other types of programs, and that not every program aspires to be a national program in that standpoint, and wants to meet more of a regional need for forensics or their students in that respect. And I think we all need to respect that, so that we don't say, well, if there aren't 10 schools at this tournament, I'm not going because after all I can't earn legs. And I think that's sad, because that then is missing an element of forensics and the camaraderie of getting together with those individuals. And I think we need to weigh that very, very carefully. I also think we need to be careful, as also echoed by members of the panel, the relationship between the forensics program and the department in which you might be housed. That there is a connection, and that connection has to be more than just the winning at tournaments. It does have to be that educational link. And then I think this is where, pick up on what Mike said, the idea of assessment. What type of track record do we have as to what our students are learning, and how do they put those skills to work after they stop being a member of a forensics program? And I think that's how you build the success of your forensics program, that these people got their jobs and are now CEOs of various companies because of their research skills, because of their analyzation skills, because of their delivery skills, whatever it may be. And I think that's very, very important. I also think that we have to be aware of the costs in the future. Electronics, yes, but electronics are not going to come cheaply, as we know. And we have to be aware of how are we going to finance all of this, and how are we going to support all of this. In that field of electronics, I think one of the things as forensics educators that we have to concentrate on is the skill of research. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, I have last access web page on such and such a date, and I think that is not what I want to hear. I want to know when that web page was initiated, who put it up, how accurate is that information, etc. And I think our students are not zeroing in on that, and we as forensics educators, I think, need to work in that particular direction. And the last comment I will make is I think we need to look very carefully at the impact of our activity on human relationship and health. Very, very concerned with the element of wellness, and I know one of the current trends, for instance, of swing tournaments that take place on Saturday, Sunday. And I'm thinking if you're teaching Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you go to a tournament on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, when do you have time for personal growth? When do you have time for your family in this? And I think we need to look at that carefully, and again, that's within the element of choice. But I'm very positive that forensics will be successful, that it will be wonderful in the future, and I don't know if I will be here in 30 years or not, but it would be fun to come back and listen to that panel and see what thoughts come then. And I really do want to thank you very much for this opportunity to share my few remarks with you.
Looks like the group left me more than enough time to say what few remarks I'd like to make. I want to thank Bob, too. I think it's been an interesting program. And I would like to direct my remarks specifically to people who introduced that's good. I can remember a few years ago when I think probably a number of us would not have had that sense of optimism. Also, something that would not have occurred a few years ago is the endorsement and the praise of diversity, which is included within the activity. I happen to chair the second developmental conference on, well, I chair the first developmental conference on forensics. One of the things that came out of that first developmental conference on forensics was the idea at that time about the only game in town was policy debate. There was not even any individual events. As a matter of fact, we tried to find some people to invite to participate who did individual events. We had to scour very hard to find anyone who was identified with individual events at that time. So, and one of the results of that conference was, partly because the conference didn't agree on everything, was that Jack Howe on his own kind of started up and pushed the CEDO organization. But there was also a documentary endorsement, documented endorsement of the idea of increased diversity. It's amazing how after that conference there was an increased amount of diversity in the activity. But I must say that at some points over the past 20 or 30 years, I wondered whether that diversity was always a good thing, because much of it did come out of criticisms and reaction to what was occurring. And now I think there is a much greater recognition within the entire forensic community that the diversity is there in part because different programs do have different needs and do have different opportunities, do have different student populations, different resources, and therefore different programs do serve some of those different needs. And at the same time, there is some effort to endorse and to reinforce and to try and find ways of working together. And it seems to me that's a very good thing. But what I want to talk about is something that's kind of related to that. I guess I want to talk about two things. One is, it seems to me that at the same time that we have developed diversity in the activity, and that we have not always thought about, we thought about the diversity in terms of our students and in terms of where we're located, but we haven't thought about where the field of communication is going and our relationship to the field of communication. Now, I recognize that not all the people that are in our activity are people who are in communication departments or who have had their background in training in communication. But it is certainly true that the communication is the dominant discipline which supports the activity. And if the activity loses the support of that dominant discipline, then I think the future of the activity is in question. I also think that the discipline has become less firmly attached to forensics, in the same way that forensics has become less firmly attached to the discipline. And I see that as a very dangerous trend for the discipline as well. When I started out in this activity, almost everybody who was anybody in communication had their roots in forensics. That is no longer true. In my department, I still have a number of colleagues who have some association with forensics. But every time we hire a new person, I'm a little nervous because this person hasn't had any background in forensics and doesn't know anything about forensics. And I wonder what the implications of that are going to be for the program at Wayne State, for the discipline as a whole. So I think we need to examine, and I would say to you young people, you need to think about how the forensics relates to the discipline. I'm concerned that the discipline has become so diverse, the discipline has gone in so many different directions that we're losing the central core of the discipline. And I think that's dangerous for the discipline. We've all heard about cases of institutions who have either completely abandoned communication programs or have gone in directions which are so far removed from what we would think of as traditional communication programs that they're not the same. Even some of the Big Ten institutions, which for so long were centers of communication, now some of those programs have moved in radically different directions, which are not central communication programs. So I think we have to ask the question, what is the core of the discipline, and how do we relate to that core of the discipline? We had as our banquet speaker at the National Debate Tournament a few weeks ago, a man by the name of Bill Plant, who's a CBS White House correspondent. And I thought his message was an important message to the students, and I'd like to give you a little bit of that message because I think it defines for me what is core to what we're trying to do in forensics, and it is core to what I think the public, administrators believe ought to be the core of our discipline, with which frequently in our search for quantitative research and theorizing about communication, criticism, most modern criticism, we forget the core of what people expect us to be doing. And That is, his message to the students was that he was excited to speak to that audience because he thought that the nature of public discourse in this nation has deteriorated. That the television now is very concerned with kind of what makes the quick news, the spot discussion rather than an extended discussion of political issues. The public is not interested in political discussions, that a lot of the discussion occurs on the internet, but it's not necessarily monitored, it's not necessarily enlightened discussion, that we've gotten to the point where almost anybody's opinion is equal to anybody else's opinion. And he was concerned about the fact that lots of the major issues of our time are not being addressed. He said to the debaters, you are people who have interest in public discourse. You are people who are aware of what's going on in the world. You are the ones who must assure that we have continued public discourse in our society. And I would say that you and us are the ones who have to continue to assure that that kind of thing goes on. And we have to find ways to make the discipline of communication recognize that that is still a central part of our mission. The reason why we are concerned with postmodern criticism is to improve the quality of public discourse. But the end product is public discourse. The reason why we've argued about CETA and parliamentary debate and NDT debate is because we were concerned about what was important in terms of public discourse. Was it information processing? Was it oral communication skills? What ought to be the priority of those? But there's never been any disagreement among us about what the ultimate goal of forensic education should be. Our only concern was what ought to be the priority in terms of training with regards to public discourse. But we've all agreed that the goal of forensic education is to make for better public discourse. Now, we need to tell that to our administrations. I'm concerned that a number of smaller private colleges have found it difficult to maintain forensic programs. They have found it too expensive. They thought it wasn't central to their mission. A liberal arts college ought to see the training of people in public discourse as central to the whole process of liberal arts education. What's the point of a liberal arts education if you don't make for a better world? If you're not going to make for a better world, the only way you're going to make for a better world is to have better public discourse. But we've somehow not gotten that message across. We've talked about communication skills without a thought of what the goal of communication skills are. Or we've talked about critical thinking without a sense of what the goal of critical thinking is and how that fits into the whole educational process, and what the mission of education ought to be, and what the mission of our field ought to be. A number of graduate institutions have gotten rid of their professional directors of forensics. And it troubles me very much that it's very difficult for many directors of forensics to get tenure at graduate institutions. And that's partly, I'll talk about that in a moment, some of the individual priorities that we set. But it's also partly a matter that we have not done a good job of selling to administrations the importance of what we are doing in terms of training people for public advocacy. So I think that one of the challenges I put to young people in particular is to stay involved in professional organizations, to communicate with your administrators, to communicate with your colleagues about what you're doing and about what the purposes of what you're doing are, to keep your whole community aware of what you're doing in the program, and to frame what you're doing not just in terms of winning tournaments, but of the skill training and the importance of that skill training. I think it's one reason why we need to occasionally have some public debates. But I think those public debates, we can't just send students out on public debates who are not well prepared, who don't know what they're talking about, who are not good models of what we think public discourse ought to be. So I think that's a major challenge we have, is to keep in touch with the discipline and let the discipline see we're at the center of the discipline and to define in part what the center of the discipline is. And it's very easy for us because we're so busy not to get involved in departmental issues, not to get involved in professional issues beyond forensics. If we lose our support in communication departments, we're going to lose the activity of the training. If we lose communication departments, the whole world is going to be less enriched because of that. have a responsibility, it seems to me, to make sure the public discourse continues. The second comment that I would make briefly is, it seems to me that the other thing that's very important, I think this panel demonstrates very much, is that if you're going to stay in the activity and make it your career and enjoy it, you have to work very hard at setting personal priorities. And I've been asked many times, how can you do this for 41 years? And sometimes I wonder how I can do this for 41 years. But the only way you can do it, you can survive and enjoy it, is if you set priorities. That is, sure, I'd like to have a national champion. I guess I'm never going to have a national champion. But that's never really been a goal in my life. What I've always been concerned with is having good programs and providing good training for students. I sometimes sacrificed some of the time I might spend with some of my teams in order to become involved in some professional activities. I've never regretted the time I've done, because it seems to me if we don't maintain our professional organizations, then the activity will not survive. I've sometimes sacrificed a program by doing things within the department and within my college. If I don't do those things, then there's not the support for the program, and the program seems trivial. If I do those things, then at my university, everybody thinks forensics is really important. The president thinks it's just about as important as anything we do. And it's taken time to do the publicity, put out the press releases, to talk to people about things, and to make people aware of what the program does. That's been an important priority for the maintenance of the program. I had a wife and family, and that was very important in my life. And I had to make time, and I was timely. At Wayne, we often have late practice debates, late in the evening, because a lot of our graduate programs are late. And so we have graduate classes in the evening, and you put evening practice debates because the students work. And it was difficult for me to find ways to be with my family. But I made it a rule that I would be home at 6 o'clock and have dinner with my family every night. And then sometimes when I had to drive half an hour home, have dinner, and then drive a half an hour back for a late practice debate. But I made time, I made that a priority. So I think that the way you can enjoy what you do, and the way that you can survive, is to set priorities. You need to have time to get away from it. One thing that really disturbs me about a lot of young debate coaches is they spend all year coaching debate during the school year, and then they go to the summer institutes, spend the whole summer coaching debate, and I would have gone crazy if I did that. It's not that I didn't do some of that, but I couldn't do it on a regular basis. I certainly never would have gotten what few publications I have out if I had done that. So you have to decide, that's what makes life exciting and challenging, is doing lots of different things. And you got to keep things in proportion, or you won't survive the activity. And I hope you will all survive. I hope you will all have fun with the activity. That's why all of us up here, as great and involved as we are, have stuck with it a long time, while we still praise the activity, while we still think it's valuable. We've been able to do those things because we set some priorities in our lives. So I compliment you for your commitment to the activity. I hope you will continue, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak.
Quickly, so that we will have some time for interaction with those of you who kind enough to come, I do want to thank the members of this panel and the members of the panel who introduced them for doing some exceptional work, for getting it right, for taking the time from your busy schedules to make it possible for us to share this forum. We've got a couple people here who flew in last night and will fly out after this panel to go back to setting up the NFA National. We got other people who were not planning to come here after a very expensive trip to this convention, after a very expensive convention in November in New York City, who made the time to be here to share their ideas with us. And I want you all to know how very much I appreciate that. And it's certainly refreshing to know that this activity, which we all enjoy, continues to be driven by and to attract people whose dedication to sharing the ideas, to getting it right, and to helping each other keep the activity alive is evident. It's in very good shape. So, questions or comments for anybody on Thank you. We have about 15 minutes, 10 minutes before we're scheduled to end. Chair. There are copies of David's comments here. He actually presented them